My name is Philip Futternick, and I'm excuse me, I'm a senior software engineer here at Vidyo for a little bit over a year now, and I'm going to walk you through how you could build a cross-platform video chat application using Xamarin. Xamarin is a platform which will allow you to deliver native applications developed in C#. It's going to allow you to share C# application logic among various targets that are being developed for. Optionally, you could share UI code as well, which we'll discuss a little bit more later. Based on results that have been measured, you could share an average of about 75% of your application code among all the mobile development platforms. And if you choose to share your UI code as well, you could get that up to close to 100%, which is pretty amazing. Now, the most common targets to develop for are iOS and Android, but you can also develop for .NET, macOS, and even watchOS and Windows Phone. The IDE to use would be Visual Studio, and for Mac, it's Visual Studio for Mac, which was formerly Xamarin Studio, but it was just rebranded when Microsoft purchased Xamarin. And on Windows, it's just the Visual Studio with the Xamarin add-on. Now, there are several different application types that you could build using Xamarin. We're going to focus on Android and iOS. And the first that we're going to discuss here is Xamarin.Android. Xamarin.Android will give you a similar development experience as an Android developer would using Android Studio. There's an XML-based UI builder where you could also drop control elements as well into, and you'll get an Android manifest file where you could assign permissions, specify Android versions that are supported, etc. And you'll get an activity lifecycle with methods like onCreate, onStart, and onResume. Now, Xamarin.iOS will give you a similar dev experience as someone would using Xcode to build an iOS app. There's a storyboard UI builder, an entitlements plist file, info.plist, an app delegate file, and then you'll have your usual ViewController lifecycle methods such as view.did.load, view will appear, view did appear, and etc. Now, Xamarin.Forms is essentially a cross-platform UI toolkit. It will allow developers to easily create native UI layouts that can be shared across iOS and Android. It includes more than 40 controls and layouts, which are mapped to native controls at runtime. And the lifecycle methods here are onStart, onSleep, and onResume. Now, something important to note is that Xamarin.Forms is not a standalone project type, but it's an accumulation of a Xamarin.iOS, Xamarin.Android project, and then along with a class library, which would be where the UI shared code would be, and potentially any application shared code. So, and then the Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin.Android projects would then use that shared library. So when you create a Xamarin.Forms application, it actually will create 3 projects, a Xamarin.iOS, Xamarin.Android one, and then a shared library. So, developer might ask the question of which flavor of Xamarin to use. The good news is that either way, you're going to get fully native apps with shared business logic. You might choose Xamarin.Forms if your application requires little platform-specific functionality, where code sharing is most important rather than a custom UI. And developers are comfortable with XAML, which is a XML-based markup language developed by Microsoft. You might be familiar with XAML if you've developed .NET WPF applications. As for Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin.Android, if your application requires native behavior, that might be the path to go. And also, if your app wants to use the many platform-specific APIs, and lastly, where the custom UI is more important than code sharing. So you're going to definitely have more control as far as UI when you use Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin.Android as opposed to Xamarin.Forms. But again, Xamarin.Forms will save you lines of code and development time. Now, if you have yet to sign up for Vidyo.io to use our SDKs, it's free to sign up at Vidyo.io. You could create a free account, get a number of developer minutes to play around with, and then you could download our SDKs, which also contain sample applications from many platforms. For Xamarin in specific, you would download the iOS and Android SDKs. After that, you could get going, start building. Now, a few important notes as far as Vidyo.io development with Xamarin is that you're going to be using our CSharp bindings. We have generated these CSharp bindings ourselves, as opposed to a different approach where you could generate bindings within Xamarin itself using generation tools. Now, our bindings consist of a native C library. So on Android, it's, well, jar is not the C library, but it's a jar file along with a .so shared library. And on iOS, it's going to be a dylib that will be referenced in your project. And on top of the native C part of it, you're going to have the C# source files, which essentially wrap the C library. The other important note here is that to render video, the video library needs to have a handle to the native control. When using Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin.Android, it's pretty straightforward because it's exposed in the UI control itself. But with Xamarin.Forms, you'll actually have to create a custom renderer for each platform to expose the handle to the native control. It's not so complicated, but it's not as straightforward as when you use Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin.Android. Before I actually walk through the code, go through creating a Xamarin.Android and Xamarin.iOS application, I'll just give you a few highlights of what I'm about to do. The first thing that any developer would want to do is to include the Vidyo.io SDK. So with Xamarin.iOS, it's Video Client iOS SDK, which contains the C# source files that were previously mentioned, and the libvideoclient.dylib. On Xamarin.Android, it has those same C# source files, but rather than the dylib, it has the shared library, the libvideoclient.so, and the videoclient.jar file. To initialize Vidyo.io, you'll call the initialize method on the connector package, and that is common between iOS and Android, but on Android, you also have to set the application UI context. Then you want to create a video connector object. This is actually it's the same call on iOS and Android. The only difference is that the view handle that you're going to be passing on iOS is of a UI view type, whereas in Android, it's going to be a frame layout type. So in the construction of the connector object, you're going to pass the handle, the type of layout that you want. Here it's specified as default. The number of remote participants, the max number of participants to render. Here we're going to set it to 15, a log level, and then a few other parameters that are not as relevant. And then to render video, it'll be the same call on both, where you call show view at, specifying the view that you want to render to, and any potential offset within that view. Next, to connect to the video chat itself, you're going to use the connect API, where you're going to specify the host that you're connecting to, which will always be prod.vidyo.io. Then a token that you will generate, which will authenticate you into that room. The display name that other participants will see you as, the resource ID, which is the room name itself. And then you'll also need to inherit the iConnect interface, which will provide status essentially on the connect call. So the iConnect interface will call back either on success, on disconnected, or on failure, depending on whether the connect call went through. To disconnect from a call, it's just use the disconnect API. And another common thing that is used on mobile is to cycle the camera from the front to back. So you could use the cycle camera API to do that. Now I'm going to get started with a demo showing you how to actually build a very simple video chat application using Xamarin.iOS and Xamarin.Android. So I previously referenced our developer website, Vidyo.io. I'll actually go to the front of it here. So if you go to developers and then downloads, that's where you could actually download the SDKs. So in this situation, you'd want to download the iOS package and the Android package. I've already done that, and I have it locally stored on my machine. So now I'm going to open up Visual Studio in a moment and get started. I'm going to share the Visual Studio after it opens. Okay, so I should be sharing now. So I started Visual Studio for Mac here, and we will get going with a new project. So let's start with iOS. We're going to develop an iOS app, single view app here. Let's call it Vidyo.io Xamarin. Let's set the target back to iOS 8 for backwards compatibility. Whoops. We'll call the solution Vidyo.io Xamarin.iOS. Actually, and we'll just leave it as is, Vidyo.io Xamarin. And let's create it. Okay, one moment. So I had downloaded the SDK already. Which you will see in a moment. Okay, so the first thing we want to do actually is to import that SDK into into our project here. So let's add it. There's two things that we want to import. First, we want to import the CSharp files. So we're going to go to. So this is the iOS SDK. Underneath there's an include directory and then C#. So we'll open that. We'll check all the files. We'll add those and we'll add a link to those. Add a link rather than copying them. And then we're also going to want to add the dylib. So that's going to be in the lib directory, iOS, and then libvideoclient.dylib.
Hey, Phil.
Yeah.
Maybe you could share your whole desktop. We're not seeing the dialog boxes that are popping up on top of the Visual Studio.
Sure. Okay. Let me stop sharing that. Entire screen. You see it now? You see it, Ben? You see Visual Studio at the moment?
Yes.
Okay. So we just added the libvideoclient.dylib. An important thing to do here is to set the build action to a bundle resource to make sure that it's actually included in the bundle after you build and put it on the device. Now, the next thing we want to do is we could open up the storyboard and start building our UI. Takes a minute to come up. A little bit longer than expected here, but here it is. Okay, so I'm going to be building for an iPhone 6 Plus. So specify that. Open up the toolbox here, and let's add a few buttons to our UI. Okay. We're going to add 4 buttons. First one, we're going to the first button we're going to call Initialize. And then when that is called, when that is touched, we will call the Initialize method. When you enter that, it actually, Visual Studio will ask you to add an event handler for that method into your ViewController.cs file. So I just did that. So next, for the next button, let's call that connect. And on the touch down of that, we'll call a method called connect. Place it there in our ViewController. Next button we'll call disconnect. Disconnect event. Place that there. And then lastly, we will have a cycle camera button. And then create a cycle camera event upon touching it. Okay, so now the events have been populated here. We do not want to call not implemented exceptions when those buttons are clicked. So let's remove that. So now upon these calls, let's create a new class here where we're going to put all of our video logic. Let's call it VideoController. So we're going to essentially mirror the events that were created in the ViewController class. So we'll call Initialize. Now in this Initialize, we're going to want to call, as we detailed in the slides earlier, connector package dot initialize. The reason it is not happy with that is that I didn't add the namespace to use Video client. Okay, and after that, we're going to need a connector object. So let's create a member variable out here called connector. Call it C, and construct it. Auto completion isn't cooperating. There we go. So the first argument is a view ID. So we're going to need that to be passed in. Then the style, we'll set the default rendering style. The number of remote participants, let's set that to 15. Log file filter, not very important here for this demo. Log file name, not important. And user data as well. So the view ID, let's pass that into the initialize call. This is essentially the handle to the native view that you want to render to, that you're going to be rendering to. So we've constructed our connector object. Now we actually want to render it, and we do that by calling show view at. And then the first argument is that view ID. And then within that view, if we want to have any offsets, we would specify that here, but we're not gonna. So we'll set the X and Y coordinates to 0. And then we're also going to need now a width and a height. So let's specify that here. And we're going to need those as arguments as well. Okay, so that'll initialize. Next, we're going to want to connect. And we would call c.connect. Now, the first argument is the host, so it's going to be prod.video.io. Next argument is a token. We'll specify that in a moment. Display name, my name here. Resource ID, which is the room that we're going to connect to it. Let's call it Philip room. And then we're going to need a iConnect interface. So let's pass it this. So now it's not going to like that yet because this class is not yet a iConnect interface. First, let's just specify the token here. So now it's not happy about this, so you're going to want to inherit the connector.iConnect. And then you want to implement the methods that are part of that interface. So essentially, as discussed earlier, when you call connect, you will get callbacks with either on success or on failure or on disconnected based on the status of that call. Let's remove the not implemented exceptions. And we want to populate a token. To generate a token, the documentation is on our website, but you're going to use your application ID and a developer key and an expiration time which will create a token which will give you access into a room. Now, I've previously generated one, and I will just populate it here. We have a token generation video on our developer.video.io website where you could get more info on how to do that exactly. So I've populated the token, and that is our connect call. Next, we want to implement connect. Connect is quite simple. We're literally going to just call c.disconnect. When you call disconnect, it'll also call back on disconnected, assuming the disconnect occurred successfully. And then lastly, let's create camera. We'll call c.cycle camera. Okay, so that is the end of our video controller class. So let's go back to our view controller. So in our view controller, let's create an instance of that view controller. VC. And we can populate the methods here. One thing I realized that we forgot in our in our storyboard is actually creating the view where the video will be rendered. So let's go back to our toolbox. Let's get a UI view. Put that in here. and make it a little bit bigger. And let's just give it a name. Let's call it Video View. Okay, going back to the view controller. Now we're going to, let's start with the initialize here. We are going to want to call initialize on the VC, video controller object. And the first argument is the view ID. So that's just a handle to the video view in our UI. And then the width and the height, which will be a video view dot frame dot width, and video view dot frame dot height. It's not happy about the type, so it's an integer, so we just got to cast it to a uint. Okay, so that is good now, and connect will be simple connect. No arguments there, and here disconnect. And now cycle camera. Okay, excellent. So the other thing that needs to be considered here is allowing your app to have camera and microphone permissions. So there's a standard way that this is done in Xamarin. So I'm going to just paste the code here into this application. Authorize media use. Also, Xamarin core libraries to allow the video and audio permissions, and we'll just call that authorized media use in our view did load. Okay, now the last thing to consider here is to go to the entitlements file. Here it is, entitlements.plist. We're gonna want to add a keychain. We'll add another element here called video license. You go to the source code here to look at it, and we just want to make sure that this app identifier prefix is included here as well. Okay, now I believe we're all set. So we could build, we set the target to a iPhone 6 Plus that I have connected, and let's give it a go. Ben, do you, am I seen as well right now, or do I need to stop sharing in order for the iPhone to be seen?
Your camera is active, so we can see your camera, and we can see your desktop Visual Studio.
You do not see my camera right now. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, your camera video is being sent as well.
Oh, it is. Okay. All right. So it's still building, as you can see in the Visual Studio. And now it's deploying it to the device. Okay, so Ben, you see the phone right now or no? So we have the UI that we created in the storyboard. Ben, it's visible, right?
It's a little hard. Maybe you can hold it closer to the camera.
Better?
Yes.
So we'll click the initialize button there. I might have missed it. There it is. So when you click Initialize, it actually shows you a preview. And then we're going to click Connect. And look at that. We have Sachin and Ben waiting in the room for us. So we have connected to Philip room. All right. So now we could disconnect. Actually, before we do that, let me just cycle the camera. Click the cycle camera button. Now you can see me. And that's it. I'll disconnect now. Click the disconnect button. And now it brings you back to the preview. So that concludes the iOS portion. And we can now go back to my Visual Studio here. I'm going to stop that. And now we could build the same application for Xamarin, for Android. I'm sorry. I'm just going to disconnect my iPhone and plug in my Android device. So we will now go to the solution and add a new project. Let's create an Android app. Vidyo.io Xamarin. Let's call this one .android. Set the target platforms to modern. And let's say everything else as is. So now we have our Xamarin Android application. So just like we did in the iOS one, let's add the SDK, the Vidyo.io SDK. In this case, we're going to add the Android one. Let's add an existing folder. First, we're going to add the CSharp files. So let's go to projects. So before we were in Video Client iOS SDK. Now we're going to be in Video Client Android SDK. Include CSharp. Now these CSharp files are exactly the same in both packages. Again, these are the wrapper to our native library. Add a link to the files. No need to copy them. So that's been added. And then we want to add a couple more things. Add files. So now we want to add the jar file and the shared library. Projects. So that's located inside lib Android. Now I know the device that I'm going to be targeting to is a ARM v7A. So I'm going to choose, we provide the shared object for various architectures that we support. I'm going to just choose the one that this application, that this Android device that I'm deploying to that type, to that architecture type. So we're going to include the shared library and then the video client.jar file. Again, add a link. So this is another important thing. We want to specify the build action. So the libvideoclient.so, we want to specify that as an Android native library. And the video client.jar is an Android Java library. Next, we could begin building the UI. So that'll be here under resources, layout, main.axml. And when you create this application, it actually creates a simple hello world application with a button for you. So we'll just take that button and leave it there, and we'll just rename it and add a few more buttons. So we're going to need 4 buttons. total. Let's rename this Hello World one to initialize. We gave it an ID, the button an ID called initialize, and then the text itself is going to have the word initialize in it. And then this button is going to be connect. The text will be connect. This button is connect. And lastly, cycle camera. And now we want to actually add the view where the video will be rendered. We need a frame layout. So let's plop that right here underneath those buttons. Where did it go? Did I lose it there? Let me get that back in there. What's going on here? Losing the frame layout. Let's give it another shot here. There we go. All right. Let's also name this frame layout. Give it an ID of video view. Okay, and now we could go to our source file, which is the main activity .cs. Now, again, it had created a button previously called My Button, so we might as well just use what it created there and rename it. Here, let's say init button, source ID .initialize. Okay, sorry, back here. And we're gonna have, let's create a reference to the 4 buttons that we have. We're gonna have init button, connect button, next button, and cycle camera button, and then needs an ID, connect, disconnect, for the IDs that we specified in the UI builder. And then we're also going to need a reference to the video view frame layout. So we're going to do that by creating a frame layout, call it video view, find view by ID, frame layout type. Oops, a fragment layout, frame layouts, and then resource.id.video view. Okay, not happy at the moment, but I think it will be once we compile. Okay, so next we're gonna just want to create events for when those guys are clicked, right? So again, there's a sample here for the button that was created, the Hello World button that was created in this app. So we'll change that to an init button. Remove what's going on there. And so when the init button is clicked, we're going to want to do something. So this is going to be the sweet part here where we could reuse some of the code that we created before in our iOS application. So that video controller class that we created, let's import that into this Android application now. Philip P. Federnick. So we're going to want to go into the project, Vidyo.io Xamarin, into the first project that we created, in the video controller. And let's add a link to the file. We don't want to have two different versions of it. So now we have the video controller.cs, and we can create a, it's no longer needed. We could create a Vidyo.io Xamarin dot video controller object. Call that VC and instantiate it. Now we could use that inside of all the button click calls. So we could call VC dot initialize. We're going to need a view ID, which will be the handle of the video view. It's video view dot handle. Next, a width and a height, so that'll be video view dot width, video view dot height. And we're going to have to just cast that into a uint. And that will finalize that one. So let's just copy this here. I want to add delegates for all of the 4 buttons. We'll do it for the connect button. Connect button. Cycle camera button. So again, we're using our video controller class that we created previously in our iOS application to call connect here. Whoops. Cycle camera. Connect. And here we'll call vc.connect. And then we'll call vc.cycleCamera. Cool. So that handles all the button clicks. And the only thing we need to do now is to just set some permissions here in the manifest file. So we're going to want to give permissions for the network state, camera, obviously, internet, since we will be using that to connect, modify audio settings, and lastly, record audio. Should do it. We're going to change the target here to the Android. We have my HTC connected, so let's try to build for it. Deploying it to the device. Installing it on the device. we're running here. I will bring the phone here to the front. We have our UI. Did we not hit it? Okay, the app crashed. Wonderful. Let's give that another whirl. Oh, I realize I know what the problem is. So the slight difference again on initialization with Android versus iOS is that, let's go back to the main activity, is that upon initialization, you actually have to call the UI context, say application UI context. So here in our init button click, we could actually add a call to connect the video client, a connector package, set application UI context, and then pass this reference to the activity. And now let's give it one more shot. So this is an example of where most of the code was reused, but there is one slight difference here that needs to be done for Xamarin, for Android as opposed to iOS. So that could be done in the in this Android specific file, as opposed to the VidyoController.cs, which is shared among the two projects. Okay, so we're back here. Hopefully, there it is. So we've initialized. We have our preview. We are going to connect, and there are our buddies Ben and Sachin. We will cycle the camera. I will say hello, and then I will say goodbye by disconnecting. And that's it. So that concludes the code walkthrough. And let's get back to slides here.
Under the how-to videos, that first link you see there, you can also navigate to that through the Vidyo.io website. Basically, all of our previous webinars that we've done, like this one, they're there, so you can go there and find them and link directly to them, as well as some other videos that we've recorded. So if you prefer, back to our poll, if you prefer learning through how-to videos, that's a great way to find those. If you like sample code, we've got two places where you can get that sample code or ready-to-go apps. One is through the package download section, which Phil showed you earlier, where you could go to the Vidyo.io website and click on package downloads. The other is on our GitHub page, which is github.com/video, and you can find all of our sample apps that we've created to kind of help you get a jump start on things. And then for help, support.video.io, you can go there to get ask questions and get help. But we also are using Stack Overflow. We just ask anytime you're asking a question on Stack Overflow, make sure you use the video tag when you're creating that question, because we monitor that tag. So any new submissions or questions that come up that have that video tag, we'll see that and get alerted to us so we can respond more quickly there. And of course, you get the benefit on Stack Overflow of the community helping respond to questions as well.